Thank you, Kevin. And thank you all for this opportunity to share some information with you. I became a student of the soil in 1989. My father, my wife and I got married in July of 1981. My father died in August. He had leukemia, lymphoma, and cancer of the bone marrow. And I've had people ask me, did the path you take have something to do with your father? And I can honestly say, no, it didn't at that time. But I started farming in 1981. And as near as I can tell, in the last 75 years, that's the worst time you could have started farming. And I worked 6 jobs in addition to farming, part-time, full-time, part-time, full-time, you name it. And desperation put me on this road, but the good Lord guided me. And I was blessed to be born and raised in a Christian family, but as my journey has continued, I've learned to stay out of his way, because if I really want to mess things up, I try and do it myself. But if I try to see where he's leading me, it goes a lot smoother, but it's not going to be easy because we're given that bit of information in Scripture. I say I became a student of the soil in 1989, and I absolutely have no trouble admitting the more I know I don't know. He has given us such an amazing creation to be caretakers of. And I can remember in 2004, Dr. Elaine Ingham was at our farm. I took her classes in 2003. And I used to say, the more I learn, the dumber I feel. And my friend in Southwest Georgia, I borrow his phrase, the more I know I don't know. And I said that in the field, and she says, well, you know why that is, don't you? And I says, well, my interpretation is that he's given us such an amazing creation to be caretakers of, that when we, in our very limited understanding, grasp a fraction of it, it's like looking through you're in a dark room and there's a light, a crack in the door, and the closer you get, the bigger the view, the bigger the view, the bigger the view. So as we start to understand a fraction of it, we see how immense it is because of his infinite wisdom in design. And she said, well, I wouldn't disagree with what you said, but my explanation's a lot shorter than yours is. I says, okay, what is it? She said, he doesn't want us to be bored. So, 89, I started down this trail. It was strictly because of desperation. The drought of 88 sent me this direction. And by 92, what I had proven the success of the alternative farming methods that we had implemented. People were interested. I started to share the information. That's when, looking back, I say that's when I started doing work as a crop and livestock nutrition advisor. And I have no problem admitting I learned a lot more from my customers than I taught them, because it was the biggest research environment you could ever have. 1994, I started studying genetically engineered crops. I had a full-service seed, fertilizer, chemical, custom application business that I was managing in addition to being a representative for an alternative crop production company. And I felt it was important that I learn this. And I had been selling seed already since 1984. And as there was a euphoric attitude connected to genetically engineered crops. And as I start digging, and this was the early days of the internet, the more I found, the more reason I had for looking at this objectively rather than euphorically. And then in 1997, I did the first on-farm research, which I'll show you the results of that. And it proved just the opposite of what we were told. And then that continued, and I'll share the rest of it as we go through this. So GMO, genetically modified organism, or genetically engineered, that's the two terms that have been used for the crops that we have. The BT was the first, the Bacillus thuringiensis. That's a naturally occurring soil bacterium that they identified that organic farmers used to be able to take this liquid and spray it on their crop. If they had a corn borer infestation, that organism would eat a hole in the gut of the insect and they would die, and it would return to the soil, and it was gone. The genetically engineered version of BT, they have found that to be still active and detrimental to soil life as much as 2 years after the BT crop has been planted and gone. CRW is the corn rootworm insecticide treatment. That was another version of genetic engineering. The glyphosate resistant, glyphosate being the active ingredient in Roundup herbicide. The herbicide resistance is what put the genetically engineered crops on the map. It just, it set it into orbit. I used to work with Hill Seed Company back before it was Champion, and Lynn Krogstad was the DSM, and he said to me one day, he says, you know, Roundup made poor farmers look like good farmers, and it made good farmers lazy. And I thought, that's an interesting observation. And we have all of these different glyphosate resistant crops on the market today. There's also glyphosate resistant wheat that has not been introduced to the market, thankfully. There has been drought tolerant wheat introduced. The Liberty is glufosinate. That's a different active ingredient than glyphosate, but they're comparable in the fact that they're non-selective. In essence, they're designed to kill everything they touch. The golden rice, the papaya, squash, apples, potatoes, flavor saver tomato. I actually am privileged to know the scientist that worked on developing the flavor saver tomato. And she is an active educator against genetic engineering technology in the food supply today, because after she saw what it did, she had a new calling, you might say. There's a lot of things coming through the pipeline that we don't know about. This is one of them. CRISPR is the second generation genetic engineering. I'll explain that a little bit more further into the presentation. Continuing on with examples, one of the first examples of genetic engineering in production livestock was the RBGH. That was a genetically engineered growth hormone that they inject into a milk cow that makes the cow give more milk. Well, it also caused mastitis, and it also caused reproductive issues. They couldn't get the cows to breed back when they were using that, and a modification to the labels, they said don't administer this until you have them bred back, because they likely won't conceive while they're on it. And interestingly enough, the United States is one of the few countries that ever allowed the application and the use of this. Genetically engineered salmon. They basically took a gene that made the salmon grow faster, and it's immense how much faster it will grow for the farmed salmon. It's been in the market now for, I think, 5 or 6 years, and the latest I read, the company that's promoting it is struggling because the consumer acceptance is quite low. The lab-grown meat, the Impossible Burger, that's, whether people know it or not, that's also the result of genetic engineering. There's also genetically engineered milk. This is an article from 2022 that tells about the introduction of the genetically engineered milk that will be coming into the food supply. Anybody familiar with the term gain of function? That kind of became popular since the manufactured epidemic called COVID was came into our history books. Genetic engineering definition is the modification or manipulation of an organism's genes using technology. Gain of function, medical research that genetically alters an organism in a way that may enhance the biological functions of the gene products. Is there a difference? Injectable GMOs. Is an mRNA experimental gene therapy injection a GMO? Dr. Andy Wakefield says absolutely, and a very, very dangerous version of it. what would be the reaction in the marketplace today from the consumers if they realized that gain of function was the same methodology used to develop genetically engineered crops? This is and you may or may not be able to see that, and I'm not going to go everything step by step by step. In 1997, I put the first plot in for BT corn. I was a Golden Harvest seed representative. I was winning awards for increased seed sales every year because they quite simply had good hybrids to sell. And they provided the seed for this test plot. I started doing test plots for them in 1984. And I have never signed a technology agreement for genetically engineered seed for one very simple reason. I read it. Enough said about that. I had 2390, which we called the old reliable. It was a very sound agronomic hybrid. It put Golden Harvest on the map. They had the BT version of it. Well, the first thing you saw was the increased seed cost per acre. All the other inputs were the same. Come down here to harvest moisture, it was 5 points wetter that year. The yield was 3 bushel, a little over 3 bushel less than the non-GMO version. So the conventional hybrid out yielded it. Bottom line was we lost $57.99 an acre by having that BT version. The next year, we repeated that plot. The harvest moisture was nearly identical, but the yield was 27 bushels an acre less. And Golden Harvest saw the same results pretty well everywhere where they had that hybrid, but they had a hybrid called 2382, which I described as a corn borer magnet. In essence, the plant breeder stopped short of doing a good job of developing a sound hybrid, because as you develop a sound hybrid, natural corn borer resistance was something that you incorporated into the genetics of that hybrid. Well, the seed companies, and of course they've ended up being bought out by the chemical companies, but one of my customers said, you know, it looks to me like they got the plant breeders got lazy and they used BT because they could sell it for more and not finish their job, which I couldn't argue with that assessment that he had. But back-to-back years, we lost over $55 an acre with that traded version. I also went on to do plots in the Roundup Ready soybeans, but I don't have that included in here. Increased yield, that was what they told us that we were going to do. Research at the University of Nebraska on Roundup Ready soybeans. For 5 years, they researched it. After that, they couldn't because the technology agreements were changed. And the only way the researchers at land-grant universities were allowed to do this research was sign another addendum that said, we'll let you have the seed. When you get the results, you show it to us and we'll tell you if you can publish it. So the research stopped. But yield drag was a very well-known term at that time. And the PhD researchers that I've been blessed to work with over the years have all said the same thing. There's no such thing as a free lunch. And Dr. Mortensen at Penn State University, I did a tag team day-long event with him back in 2012, and he explained it best. He said, when that trait kicks into gear and that function is performed in that plant, it is going to take energy and nutrition away from the other characteristics of the plant. So whenever there was a true analysis of this is the conventional version of the hybrid and this is the traded version, when you had the side-by-side, many times you saw a reduction in yield. And if it was a glyphosate resistant version, the yield reduction could be substantial because of the damaging effects of glyphosate itself, which I'll get into that more later. But that research never saw the light of day, and I found out about it when I started working with Dr. Huber in 2009, because he had all the extension bulletins that showed as much as a 40 bushel per acre drop in yield on glyphosate tolerant corn that had glyphosate sprayed on it. The good news was you could get part of that back if you applied the right micronutrients to compensate for the tie-up of the glyphosate. Continuing on as far as increased yield, and I got ahead of myself on this aspect, but in 2009, the Union of Concerned Scientists published a study that shows there was no intrinsic yield from GMOs, and we'll hear in the marketplace today, well, look at our corn yields today. They're way higher than they ever were before we had genetically engineered crops. That's true. But the reason for the increase in yield is because of hybrid seed corn development. There has never been a proof of an increase in yield from genetic engineering unless you had a BT hybrid that didn't have natural resistance and you had a high corn bore pressure year, which that used to be 1 in 19. Nobody is familiar in this part of the state when we've had a high corn pressure or high corn bore year. The USDA in 2014 published a study that said genetically engineered crops do not yield more, but they provide convenience. The herbicide use rates in the beginning with the original version of Roundup, it was 32 ounces per acre. By 2010, I know of producers in Ohio that were using 96 ounces per acre in a single application and would put on as much as 2 and 3 applications of that. In Argentina, they started with 2 liters per hectare. By 2010, they were at 10 to 20 liters per hectare. Charles Benbrook did a study that looked at the increased use of glyphosate in our country through 2014, and this is a map of what the glyphosate use looks like today, and of course the darker areas are where more of it is used. The insecticide use, we're at roughly 90% of the BT, of the corn in the country was BT. Okay, does anybody realize that if you plant 32,000 plants per acre, you're putting on the equivalent of 3.17 pounds of actual insecticide? Because every genetically engineered BT seed is registered with EPA as an insecticide. And this doesn't take into account the seed treatments, the neonicotinoids, which is commonplace on all genetically engineered crops. It doesn't take into account that either. So, and that's on corn and soy. It's almost impossible to get genetically engineered seed that isn't treated with a neonic. And that's a deep rabbit hole to go down to look at all of the environmental and health effects to mammals associated directly to the neonicotinoid. And the thing that I haven't said yet that I need to say, the public and the farming community has not been told the truth in any of this. And as we go along, you're going to get to a point to where you may say, well, they flat out lied to us, and that wouldn't be wrong. I just got this email yesterday. Right now there are 25 years after the introduction of the BT technology, we've got 43 known resistant insects. And now they're talking about using RNA and RNAi. Folks, that is scary. That is absolutely Pandora's box flung wide open. So what's the motivation? As I said, I started selling seed, and I put my first plot in 84, started selling seed in 85. And the last year I sold seed was 2012. Best year of my life when I quit selling seed. But at that time, we could differentiate between the technology fee and the seed cost. Today, you can't figure that out too easy because most of the seed companies won't even let you know what the conventional version and the traded version are. They throw the numbers around enough to where you can't figure it out, depending on what seed company you're dealing with. So I sat down with a paper and pencil and calculator, and I thought, I'm going to do the calculation. I'm going to use USDA's planted numbers, and I'm going to use the tech fee for corn. That year we had 87.9 million acres. The tech fee, again figuring 30,000, which they're planting thicker than that today, at 60 bucks an acre was the tech fee. So that would dollar up 100% presumption of all the acres that USDA had, $5,274,000,000. Soybeans, it was 78.9 million acres. The tech fee equated to $24 an acre, so that was just under 1.9. And change on cotton, 10.9 million acres, $78 an acre, 850 million. I had the privilege of working with cotton producers in southwest Georgia starting in 2012. And in 1993, before there was genetically engineered cotton, the 50-pound bag of seed was from $45 to $60 per bag. By 2010, they were no longer selling a 50-pound bag. They were selling 230,000 seeds per bag, and that bag might weigh from 38 to 46 pounds, depending on the size of the seed. The cost of the seed was $159.99. The tech fee was $412.20. The seed treatment, which was a combination of insecticide, nematicide, and fungicide that you had to use on the seed, or you wouldn't get a stand of cotton, because there were so many pests in the soil from all the damage they had done to the natural protectors in the soil. You needed it. So it was $697.19 by 2010. I circled back, and in 2013, I no longer was working down there, but I circled back with my retired extension friend in 2018, and he couldn't get the breakout on the tech fee because it did the same thing with corn. But from 1994 till 2018, the cost of the seed per acre changed. Continuing on with the tech fees, sugar beets, again, if we presumed 100% implementation in 2010, there were 96 million. Canola, we don't plant much of that here. It was only 9 million. So subtotal for 1 year's tech fee. This is not seed, this is not fertilizer, this is not chemical. This is just the technology fee on the genetically engineered seed, presuming 100% implementation, was just short of $8.7 billion. I have been blessed to give many presentations in Canada to canola farmers. And so I've included the canola acres there, again, for 2010. So you look at North America, you're roughly at $9.9 billion tech fee for 1 year. No seed, no fertilizer, no chemical. What might be the motivation for this technology? This is my crude example of the DNA of a plant or an organism. And the original insertion process was like a shotgun device where they shoot in the trait that they want, and it's going to hit and or displace these different molecules. I was making the statement that they had a 1 in 100,000 chance of hitting the same spot twice. And you're going to find out why that's important pretty quick. But I made that statement at a presentation in Eastern Washington State, and there was one lady that came to come and hear my talk. Myself and the two people that organized the talk were there, and this one lady. And I'm going through my talk, and I get to that 1 in 100,000, and she politely raises her hand, and she said, "Howard, I'm a retired molecular microbiologist from Washington State University, and your odds are way too good." So she sent me the slide, and I was blessed to react with her many times by email to get information that I didn't have. She said, it's 1 in a trillion to 1 in 100 trillion. And then she says, wait a minute, that was wrong. It's 1 in a sextillion to 1 in 100 sextillion. Well, I usually stop with trillion because people are familiar with that, because that's what our deficit is. The second generation genetic engineering, they're using CRISPR technology, clustered regulatory interspace short palindromic repeats. CRISPR is a whole lot easier to say. They snip and insert, and they're saying, well, it's precise. Well, why are they saying it precise? Because they told us the first one was precise, even though it wasn't. the thing that they cannot do with CRISPR. They cannot control in any way, shape, or form the interspatial relationship between the molecules in that genome. Well, they thought when they mapped the genome, they had it figured all out. One gene, one function. Well, then a few years later, they said, well, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense at all. And this interspatial relationship is critical. You want to know something? The good Lord's the only one that knows how to put this together, right? And every time they do a true independent study on CRISPR technology products, they get side effects. So, we need to remember, we're told that GM crops are safe. We've been doing it for thousands of years, and the government approved it. I would suggest, if you like to read, you get a copy of Stephen Drucker's book. I know him personally. He's an amazing attorney, and he dug into this thing. He and I have shared the stage a number of times in different parts of the country, and it really tells the true story of how this all came about. Experience of side effects. As I said, I've been blessed to work with farmers across the U.S. and Canada for quite a few years. In 1998, got a call from a customer in Nebraska. He planted his first BT corn. The seed salesman convinced him that if he didn't plant this, he was missing out. But when he harvested it, he put it in a separate bin. And he had all of his other corn in another bin. He made feed, put the boar in with the sows, and his normal conception rate dropped 30%. And he's like, he calls us and he says, what's going on? I said, we don't know, but we've heard issues, go back. So he made feed for the next group of sows out of the conventional corn. Conception's back to where it was before. Customer in South Dakota on a computerized record keeping system. Everything in, everything out, they had all the data. When they fed BT corn to the sows, they had they had a reduced litter size. It was 1.2 pigs less per litter, and the weight of the piglets when they were born was smaller. In southwest Iowa, there was a producer and it was a Northrop King hybrid. He had something called pseudo-pregnancies. The sows appeared to be bred, they'd go full term, and upon delivery, all you'd get was the afterbirth. And he was a Farm Bureau member, and a reporter for the Farm Bureau spokesman heard about his plight, came out, did a story, published it, and after that story came out, he's getting phone calls from farmers in the area that all had the same problem. Well, you know, he's working with a vet, they worked with Iowa State, they were doing all their due diligence, trying to figure out what was wrong. These farmers all get together and talk, and lo and behold, they're all feeding the very same BT corn. When they switched, the problem went away, but Iowa State was certain the corn had nothing to do with it. In our part of Iowa, we saw ileitis, salmonella, bloody bowel, ulcers. This was prevalent in postmortem of pigs that died of digestive diseases that were consuming the genetically engineered corn. So we've got reproductive and digestive issues that I called it circumstantial coincidental. Dr. Ingham corrected me and she says, no, Howard, that's anecdotal. As I said, I've been blessed to work with many, many scientists. Dr. Arpad Pusztai was the first scientist in the world to do a true sound scientific study on a genetically engineered crop. He did it on BT potatoes, and he was totally of the mindset that this was going to be positive because we could use less insecticide. And he did it right. He had the isogenic lines, he grew them side by side, everything was monitored. It was the most complete study that's ever been done in the history of genetic engineering. And it was never repeated because of what happened to him. But the thing that he taught me was It's not what they're inserting. A lot of people will say, well, you know, BT eats a hole in the gut of an insect, so it's going to cause a disruption in the gut of a mammal. That's highly possible. But the thing that our pod believed, and he never got to continue in his field of research to prove it, because his career was basically eviscerated overnight when he told the truth in an interview. He was a star with the consumers for a week, and after the call went from Tony Blair to the White House to Arkansas, back to the White House, back to Tony Blair, his career of 350 plus peer-reviewed published scientific papers and recognized worldwide as a lictin expert was destroyed. They defunded him, they put him in a closet until his contract ran out. They just obliterated him. So nobody followed in his footsteps to do that. But I was blessed to connect with him by email, and he mentored me for quite a few years. He said it is the insertion process, doesn't matter what they're inserting, that gives you a high likelihood of having the development of a foreign protein in the fruit of this plant. Okay? 70 to 80% of the cells of our immune system are in our digestive tract. This is my illustration. I used to push against the wall, but sometimes I speak where I can't. This is my illustration of a foreign protein entering the digestive tract, and this is the immune system. An alarm goes off. Some kind of an invader. I need to do my job. I need to protect my host. So I start working to try and get rid of this 24/7, 365. So if I push against that wall for 24 hours, what's going to happen to my strength? Are autoimmune illnesses increasing in our country? Now I'm going to show you some pictures of hog stomachs. The graphic. If you're skittish, you cut your head, and if you pass out, don't worry, I know CPR. Dr. McGuire is the veterinary that took me through the Supreme Pack, south of Sioux Center, Iowa, in 2008. And Dr. Newman is the veterinary I was privileged to work for 8 years while I was struggling to maintain finances farming. Whoops. This is what a normal pig stomach should look like. Notice the skin tone color. This yellow mucus, you're going to see that to varying degrees in more of the pictures or not. It's there because there's nothing in the stomach to digest. It's the amino acids and the enzymes generate that mucus. So that's what a healthy pig stomach should look like. And I know that's a non-GMO fed pig because I harvested the stomach from the pig. This is a drug-free GMO-fed pig from Supreme, based on what Dr. McGuire told me. Notice the redness, the irritation, the inflammation. Let's remember that inflammation is the first sign of the body trying to protect itself from something. This is another one, and if you can see, there's some darker areas where there are ulcers that have healed over. This is a pig that was on antibiotics its whole life up until the point of withdrawal prior to slaughter. And you can see that it doesn't have the inflammation. Well, that's the benefit of the antibiotic in feeding it. But there are signs of ulcers in that stomach. And this is the worst antibiotic-fed pig stomach that I have a picture of. I remember the first time I showed this to a group of farmers in South Dakota. There's a guy in the back of the room that worked for the local co-op and specialized in the feed division. He said, "There's no way that pig should be alive." And I said, "Well, don't worry, it's not." I was calling this circumstantial coincidental evidence. And I took Dr. Elaine Ingham's classes in 2003. She said, "Howard, this is anecdotal." That's the correct term. Now, do a scientific study. So the good Lord again was watching out for me. I connected with Dr. Judy Carmen in Australia, and in 2008 I coordinated a lifetime feeding study where we fed 86 pigs a non-GMO corn and soy diet and 86 pigs a GMO corn and soy diet. It was a double-blind study. We took them right off their mama. They were from a GMO feed-fed sow herd because we couldn't find both. But we took that. They were weighed. They were split by sex. Everything was evenly divided, and then we drew numbers out of the hat to see who was going to be fed what. So there was absolutely no bias. And this is a picture of the autopsies that Dr. Versteeg and Dr. Robbins were the two licensed practicing veterinarians that did the necropsy work. We harvested all the pigs at Supreme Pack and collected all the viscera. We had all the pigs ear tagged and everything was documented. We had the buckets numbered and we lined everything up. We did this in December, thankfully, so we had more time to buy before the aroma started to become more obvious from some of the pig stomachs or the viscera. And this is Dr. Robinson scoring the stomach and Dr. Carmen doing the recording the data. Again, this is a non-GMO fed pig stomach. This is a GMO fed pig stomach. The statistical results of the study was the GM fed pigs had a 260% increased likelihood of having severe inflammation in their stomach. For the males, it was a 400% increase, and the females, it was 220% increase. The weight of the utera of the GM fed female was 25% heavier at an abnormal weight. We didn't have the money to do the full histological analysis on this, so that's as far as it went. The anecdotal concerns that we didn't anticipate in the study was irritability and difficulty performing simple tasks. This is a circle corral and a runway where when the pigs got bigger, Dr. Pushtai looked at the protocol after we had it done, and he said, you need to weigh the pigs every week. I said, we'll weigh them into the nursery, we'll weigh them out of the nursery, and we'll weigh them when we're done. He said, no, you will weigh them every week. I said, that's a lot of work. He said, I don't care. You will do it. So when they're little, we picked them up, put them on the scale, wrote down their ear tag, wrote down their weight, put them back. But when they got bigger, you couldn't do that. So we had this simple maze. Well, the people that weighed the pigs didn't know who was who or what was what, but they were always in that pen, this pen, this pen, and this pen. It was a Cargill-style unit, so they'd open the gates, bring the pigs down the alleyway, go through the simple maze, and the pigs in Pen A and Pen B went through this simple maze easy and without hassle, and this was kind of playtime. They'd go through this little maze, and then they'd get on this jiggly thing, and then they'd get to run around until they got locked up again. When they're back in their normal surroundings, they were fine. But the pigs in Pen C and Pen D couldn't navigate this simple maze every week. As soon as you put them in confined quarters, they start fighting and biting and picking on one another, and then they're back in their normal surroundings. They're listless. They never exhibit a level of contentment. Well, we couldn't even mention this in the study because we didn't anticipate it, so we didn't have it as part of our protocol to monitor that behavior issue. Dr. Carmen went on to do a study with Roundup Ready soy and the triple stack corn that we had in our pig study on rats, and she had it set up to monitor the results. But she got booted out of the university, so the study will likely never get published, and because it never will get published, I can't tell you the results. But I'll ask you a question. In 1995, before 85% of the processed foods in the grocery store contained ingredients from genetically engineered crops, how many people did you know were on mood-altering medication for issues like ADD, ADHD, and on down the line, versus what it is today when 85% of the processed food in the grocery store contains ingredients from genetically engineered crops? And I will tell you that I've been blessed to work with frontline researchers and veterinarians all across North America, that when you throw a little glyphosate residue in with this foreign protein, you can really make things get interesting in the mood of the animals, especially horses. We've seen where they were mild and calm, and all of a sudden they're trying to kill somebody that's working with them, and they tested the feed and they found glyphosate residue. They cleaned up the feed and the problem went away. Glyphosate, the most widely used herbicide in the world. If you want to take a deep dive on this, do an internet search, Children's Health Defense Understanding the Basics of Glyphosate. It's an article that I wrote. It was actually a polite correction that I sent to Robert F. Kennedy Jr. after listening to a speech that he gave. And I did it as delicately as I could, but I still, okay. And he was likely misinformed, and I gave him the benefit of the doubt. And 20 minutes after I sent him the email, which I worked on it for 7 days before I actually sent it to him, because I wanted to make sure I didn't do anything to offend him, because I'd already worked with him for 3 years by that point in time. But 20 minutes after he got it, I got a reply, "Howard, this is absolutely brilliant. Thank you for sharing it." Well, it was a full history of glyphosate, which I'll share some of that with you now. Again, glyphosate's the active ingredient in numerous glyphosate-based herbicides that became very popular when the glyphosate-resistant crops came into being. Glyphosate was first developed in 1950. It sat there and did nothing until 1964, when Stauffer Chemical Company figured out it was a tremendous chelator. And it was first used to clean out pipes, because it was so effective at grabbing onto minerals. The scale in our water pipes is mineral deposit. Well, they run this through the pipes, clean the pipes out, because it grabs onto calcium, magnesium, manganese, zinc, iron, copper, nickel, cobalt, boron, selenium, molybdenum, and potassium, and don't let go. It was patented as a herbicide in 1969, put on the market in 1972. Got ahead of myself. Chelate is a Greek word meaning claw or to hold, and glyphosate will make nutrients bio-unavailable wherever it is present. And I'll get into a little further explanation of that further down the line. This is Dr. Huber's slide. It's a mineral chelator. It's extremely persistent. There are parts of the world where they've done soil tests that can account for every amount of glyphosate that's been applied in the last 20 plus years, because they have the data to show how much has been applied and how much has showed up in the soil tests that they've done. It's a growth regulator. It absolutely is a very potent biocide. I'll go into that a little deeper. Also known as an antibiotic. The synthetic amino acid part, the science hasn't caught up with that component yet. I'm hoping that one particular study gets published this year that's going to demonstrate that, and it's probably the most scary aspect of the product when that comes to light. So this is Dr. Bob Kramer's schematic. Glyphosate was so tremendously effective as a herbicide, it was a 1 in 100 year discovery as a herbicide, because it's systemic. It translocates everywhere. You put a drop of it on there, it goes everywhere in the plant. Well, a minimum of 20% of it is exuded into the soil through the root system. And again, wherever it ends up, it's going to chelate minerals. And I'll show you a study that exemplifies the issues of that. Now, glyphosate doesn't kill weeds. Now, that's got to be the dumbest statement you ever heard from anybody in your lifetime, because it's the most widely used herbicide in the world. This study proves it does not kill weeds. They took those pots and they went to the field and they filled them with soil. And they planted an edible bean like you'd grow in the garden, in each pot. Pot A, they put in the autoclave before they planted the seed. So it killed all the bacteria and all the fungi. That was sterile soil. I didn't think you could grow anything in sterile soil, but you can if you've got enough mineral composition there and you water it. So the beans grow up and they get to that stage of growth, and they sprayed the one in sterile soil, they sprayed the one in the regular field soil, and this is the control. Well, this one kept growing, didn't it? Why did that one die? Glyphosate don't kill weeds. The patent says it affects the EPSPS enzyme, which is in essence the highway by which the nutrients and the amino acids flow in the plant. The flow of the nutrients, specifically the growth hormones, is stopped when you put the glyphosate on. That's why that bean is stunted. This one kept growing. After 2 weeks, when the glyphosate exited that plant, it could start growing again. And this has been demonstrated with applying a fungicide at the same time they apply the glyphosate. It will completely neutralize all of the herbicidal activity, because glyphosate shuts down the plant's growth hormones and it shuts down its defense mechanism. You and I have an immune system. Plants have a defense mechanism. So you're tying its hands behind its back, putting a brick on its head. It can't move. The thing that kills that plant is an opportunistic fungi. Glyphosate kills the beneficial organisms in the soil and promotes the growth of the opportunistic organisms. So when a plant is quote unquote resistant to glyphosate herbicide, it is not resistant to the herbicide. It has built up its resistance to the disease that was killing it. That's why they typically become super weeds. The amaranth pigweed was the first one to get its claim to fame. It used to be this tall when it was full grown. I'm getting ahead of myself again. This is what I mentioned on the fungi, as far as wiping out the herbicidal effect. This is Dr. Kramer's study, and it shows how it affects the microbiome of the soil. Fusarium is a bad thing. You don't want that. The Pseudomonas, the manganese reducers in the IAAs, the Pseudomonas are good bacteria. The manganese reducers, the more of them you have, the better. The indoleic acetoacid, that's your growth hormone producers. Well, look what happens when you put glyphosate on. It takes down the good guys and it raises the bad guys. On the manganese reducers and oxidizers, they'll be at 90% good and 10% bad until you put glyphosate on, and it goes 90% bad and 10% good. So now you just reduce the most efficient means of manganese uptake in that plant. This is a partial list of the diseases that have come into a growing and persistent problem basis as a direct result of glyphosate use. And it goes from apples to wheat. And it would go from A to Z if I had the zucchini one on there too. The long-term use of this is becoming more and more prevalent. This study was done in Europe by Rome Health. I actually had the privilege of driving him halfway across the state of Iowa after a conference. Dr. Huber and I were in Canada the first week in June. We got off the plane, went with an agronomist that Dr. Huber's been working with. We drove 2 hours the wrong way from where we were supposed to go to look at a field that was in lentils last year. The agronomist had everything mapped out. They had soil tests, they had put on the right nutrition, they were doing tissue tests, they were doing sap testing, they were foliar feeding, and their goal was 65 bushel lentils. Well, 55 is a bumper crop, but they were going to go for 65. They were doing everything they were supposed to. The last tissue test and sap test came back. They needed this micronutrient, and they needed phosphorus. So they put on a polyphosphate with the foliar. Glyphosate accumulates on the clay particles in the soil. Remember, it's a very strong chelator, so it's going to attach to the clay particle just like a mineral would attach to the clay particle, depending on what the charge is. So you have that glyphosate residue in high clay soil. In this area of Canada, the CEC level is from 37 to 41. You probably don't have that heavy a soil in this part of Iowa, but up there it is. They sprayed this foliar application on this field of lentils, and 10 days later they were dead. The phosphorus, which is soundly documented in science, will trigger a desorption of the glyphosate residue from that clay particle in the soil, and not even a genetically engineered crop can tolerate the uptake of glyphosate from the root system. It'll kill it. But these were not genetically engineered. And the glyphosate residue that they're getting in just about every grain crop in Canada is making it difficult for some of the farmers to sell. And we saw a paper that some of the grain merchandisers started using that said, I did not use this, or this chemical while I raised this crop, and I certify there's no glyphosate residue in this grain I'm delivering. If they sign that, they just signed away their farm, because they will not get the liability insurance coverage that they'll need to protect them if that ever comes back on them, because they virtually cannot sell any crops in that region that aren't contaminated with some level of glyphosate. This is an old picture back in the bonanza days of the acceleration of the glyphosate tolerant. There was Amy Bandy took that picture in southeast Iowa. It was her customer that had the green non-GMO cornfield. This is a very interesting picture from Illinois. This is a Roundup Ready soybean field that was sprayed twice, with the exception of this little corner. Instead of, to make sure you didn't hit the boom on the high boy against the power line, you just drive a little wide. Well, guess what? They didn't die from SDS. They were still producing yield. And SDS is absolutely connected to glyphosate. This is research that Dr. Kramer and Zobioli did. It shows that all of the natural functions and efficacy of crop production for soybeans decreased with glyphosate, and the need for the amount of water, it took over twice as much water to raise the same amount of plant biomass. I mentioned the amaranth pigweed. I worked with this farmer in southwest Georgia. We actually got rid of 98% of his pigweed without any herbicide. That's another story for another time. That's what it looked like when it growed up. And of course, water hemp has become resistant. It's a cousin to the amaranth pigweed in corn. Now this is work of Dr. Nancy Swanson. She did a correlation comparison, and she looked at the introduction of GMO crops and the subsequent use of glyphosate herbicide and a host of different things that I'm going to share with you. This is the increase in the super weeds starting back here at 1990 and going through 2010. And this is correlation, it's not causation. I will make that point perfectly clear. We know that there are 35 plus weeds worldwide that are glyphosate resistant. That number probably needs to be updated. Now this, if you really like to take a deep dive, go to the U.S. Patent Office website and do a patent search by number, type in patent number 7771736, and it will take you to this patent, which was filed by Monsanto, a scientist at Monsanto. They were granted the first version of the patent in 2003. In 2010, it was updated, and it documents the fact that glyphosate is in effect an antibiotic. They filed it in 2003, yet when Dr. Kramer at the University of Missouri, a USDA ag research scientist, was trying to get science published that showed that glyphosate was having an adverse effect on the microbiome of the soil, he was shunned and called every name in the book by Monsanto and even some of his supervisors at USDA, and it wasn't until 2008 that he got his first study published in the European Journal of Agronomy, because he couldn't get anything published in the United States. But they're saying, no, it don't cause problems. Kramer's crazy. Well, he started doing his research in 1996, and he was a very good friend of mine, but regrettably it's not regrettable, he's in heaven now. But that's another story. And as you read through this, you're going to see it damages the lactobacillus, the Enterococcus faecalis, the bifidobacteria, all your beneficials. But it promotes the E. coli, the salmonella, all of the opportunistic. It does the same thing in the soil that it does in the gut. And you're going to see the side effect of that. In 2015, in March, the World Health Organization, IARC, classified it as a probable carcinogen. There's research Seralini and others has done that shows the complete formulation versus the glyphosate is as much as 1,000 times more toxic than just the active ingredient. So glyphosate residue, the U.S. Geological Service did a survey in 2010 and 11 in Iowa, Mississippi. They found it in the air, in the rain, and the rivers. I tell everybody the other states were fine because it didn't look there. The amount of glyphosate in the first inch of rain was 0.48 grams. Well, that's more than it takes to have the chelation effect on an acre of crop. They found it in alfalfa, barley, corn, edible peas, potatoes, soybeans, wheat. That list goes to eternity now. Manure. And I'm going to show you an interesting study about this. We learned this early on. Dr. Michael McNeil, who's at Algona, Iowa, outstanding researcher and PhD scientist, crop consulting, and he documented the presence of glyphosate in alfalfa hay that caused problems in the health of animals, and he tracked it back that it came through the chicken litter. Well, today we know that 2/3, if you put on 3 tons of confined animal feeding operation poultry litter that's fed conventional grain, you're going to get 2/3 of a quart of Roundup free of charge between the content of glyphosate and AMPA in that 3 ton of manure. Well, when USDA got involved in the organic rules and regulations business back in 2000, one of the first things they did is says, okay, it's fine to put CAFO manure on certified organic land. So people wonder, how did we get glyphosate contamination in organic crops? That may be a reason. I said that already. Okay, this study was just published, and I apologize if you can't read it, but it's the saga of the soggy sauerkraut. Dr. Huber worked directly with this project. It happened in Wisconsin, and I won't say the name of the company. I don't think he mentions it in the study either. But they had certified organic cabbage being raised and non-organic cabbage being raised. Well, your hands are tied what you can do nutritionally when you're raising organic crops. So poultry litter was the choice. What happened when they go to make the sauerkraut, it came out as applesauce. They called it soggy sauerkraut because it had no texture in it. So Dr. Huber, being an excellent epidemiologist, among other things, did the work to trace it back to the mineral deficiencies that caused the lack of texture and structure in the cabbage. And that's why it didn't ferment. That company threw away $1 million worth of organic sauerkraut because they couldn't sell it. And the glyphosate residue in the poultry litter was the culprit because it tied up the copper and the magnesium and the manganese, which were crucial to getting the right elemental balance to make the cabbage have integrity. Continuing on with the residues. In 1994, EPA said 2 parts per million per day per life was okay. But in 97, the limit was 0.10 ppm. They raised it to 20 parts per million. 20,000% increase. And now it's at 40. And if you go to the EPA's website and look at the residues of glyphosate that's allowed, you'll see from 0.1 to 200 parts per million, depending on what item you're looking at. Certain forages for animals, 200 parts per million. Other things, 1/10 of a part per million. Now, if you understand anything about science, you've got to scratch your head and say, how come 1/10 of a part per million is all they allow here and 200 is what they allow over here? Well, we've investigated this, and every time they've changed these levels, there's no science associated with it. So you could speculate that these levels are being found out in the real world, and they're being set so that illegal products are not going on the market, maybe. Seralini documented that 0.5 ppm causes infertility, affecting both the sperm and the egg. Another study he did, 0.2 part per million caused endocrine disruption. Endocrine disruption in a forming fetus in the womb spells birth defects. In an adult, it causes a malformation of mass in the body, also known as a tumor. 2.03 parts per million, Dr. Carrasco did a study on frogs and chicks and saw the craniofacial disruptions. The Seralini study, they put 1/10 of a part per billion in the drinking water on purpose for the rats. It was a 2-year study. He was duplicating the study that Monsanto did for 90 days, and he added this as an extra. But their 90-day study showed no issues with their Roundup Ready corn. Seralini took his study to 2 years. Well, guess what? 2 years in a Sprague-Dawley rat is 70 years in an adult's life. You know, that's kind of what we're supposed to live, is 70. The tumors started showing up in the rats at 4 months, and I'll get to that a little later. This is from my friend in Denmark. I spoke at the Acres USA conference in 2008, and I told about the issues we had seen. This was after we had done the study, but it wasn't published until 2013, so I couldn't tell the results. But I had all the anecdotal information to share. Well, he calls me up, and he's in Denmark, and he don't feed corn. He feeds soybean meal, and he feeds small grain. And he said, will it pay me to switch to non-GMO soy on my sows? And I said, absolutely. Well, it's going to cost me X number of kroner more per ton. I said, I don't care. It's going to pay for itself. So he switched, and it paid for itself. Diarrhea went away, sow death went away, pig production went up, pig scours went away. But he knew he still had glyphosate residue because in Denmark, they were using pre-harvest desiccation with Roundup to get the small grain to ripen. They don't have enough growing season, so they go out and spray it with Roundup when it's close. They dry it down, then they go harvest it. Guess where the Roundup ends up? In the bedding and or the grain. Well, he fills his grain bin one time a year. He puts the whole, at that time he was putting the whole year's feed supply in so he could take a composite sample and test it for glyphosate residue, which he did. He had from 0.25 to 2.27 parts per million glyphosate residue show up in his feedstuffs and or bedding. He's getting these birth defects in these pigs. And he says, Howard, what do I do with them? I said, I don't know. He put them in the freezer, and he kept accumulating them. And then one day, we found Dr. Monica Kruger, and it wasn't the freezer in the house. I know his wife. She wouldn't have tolerated that. This is the Christmas pig. It was born alive. It was born on Christmas Day. He had a video of it that, it didn't live long. He did euthanize the ones that needed it. But he takes these pigs to Dr. Kruger, and she analyzes the lung, the liver, the kidney, the muscle, the brain, the intestine, and the heart. And remember, it was 0.25 to 2.27 parts per million. Well, these are parts per million levels that they've detected. We're told that glyphosate doesn't bioaccumulate. How did it go from 0.25 to 80 if it doesn't bioaccumulate? This is a stillborn baby calf in a part of the country where manganese deficiency was never a problem before glyphosate-resistant crops. And manganese is one of the first micronutrients that glyphosate will tie up in the soil. This is the work of Dr. Monica Kruger. She worked at the Leipzig University in Germany. That was on the other side of the wall. That's why nobody could mess with her. she did amazing research. And then when she came out in the open and started telling it, that's when she was attacked. And at the right time, she said, I've had enough of this. I'm going to enjoy my retirement. And I had the amazing privilege of communicating with her by email and meeting her in person in Beijing, China in 2014. But it took 1/10 of a part per billion of glyphosate residue in the rumen of the cow to kill the lactobacillus, the Enterococcus fecalis, and the bifidobacteria, and that allowed the Clostridium to go haywire and the E. coli. So guess what? When the Clostridium goes berserk, you have toxic co-infectious botulism. They had chronic and or acute botulism. We're seeing chronic botulism in dairy cows all across North America, but you know what they call it? Failure to thrive. Their gut sucks up and their production holds for a little while, and then finally, and the dairies, the way they manage it is, okay, we'll just take them to town before they're going to die, and we'll dump them at the pound cow plant. Well, that worked fine until the tumors started showing up on the cows, and they tank them when they got to the door. And I'm at the pound cow sale how many years ago, and I'm telling my friend, high school classmate, who bought for the biggest pound cow slaughter plant in the country, and every time we'd sit down, I'd say something about GMOs or glyphosate, and he'd roll his eyes, and oh yeah, there's Howard again. This one time I'm telling him about all the issues of the glyphosate residue in the feedstuffs, and how the one producer that was working with a nutritionist that we were advising, the cows are crashing, they take them to the slaughter plant and they tank them. They're starting to tank them all. Well, they got tumors. And they had tumors at the top of the mammary and in the flank. As we're sitting there talking at the pound cow sale, and he's messing with his phone, and he shows me a picture. Here's a cow like you just described. He shows me another picture. Here's another cow like you just described. He puts his phone away, and a Holstein cow walks in the ring, and he said, she's got them. She had tumors right here and right at the top of the under of the tail head. Pound cow market that day was $53. That cow brought 5 cents a pound. I looked at him, I said, why? I said, they're tanking them at the slaughter plant. He said, hiding offal, which, you know, $100 a head for drop credit, and they make dog food yet. This is the Seralini study for 2 years. And I'm not going to bore you with the statistics. The pictures tell you what you need to see. Out of that study, there's multiple studies been published. Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is rampant in our country right now. Glyphosate residue, 1/10 of a part per billion, which is way below what EPA allows in the water, will cause it. Dr. Paul did the study on kidney failures, and it was people with kidney failures. They took urine samples and he analyzed for glyphosate. Guess what? The people with the highest glyphosate levels residue had the worst kidney health. Birth defects in South America, where they're flying on the Roundup Ready soybean fields. Dr. Avaro spoke at that conference in Beijing in 2014, right ahead of me, and I didn't speak Spanish and he didn't speak English. And when he got done talking, Dr. Huber and I both had tears in our eyes, as did everybody in that room, because he showed the devastation that was happening to those poor people that lived adjacent to those fields where they were aerial applying Roundup. Yakima Valley, there was a tremendous surge in the anencephaly. And it coincided with when they started using rodeo, a generic version of glyphosate, to spray the irrigation canals to keep the weeds down. It's been found virtually everywhere you can think when this study was published, my friend in Australia, he says, now they've gone too far. He said, we can't even drown our sorrows anymore. They found it in organic and conventional wine. In Florida, it's in the water system. You can't get away from it. Even the organic operations are pulling out of the aquifer. And they don't have much clay content in the southern part of Florida. So it doesn't bind to the soil. It just goes straight through. When you have that low CEC level, it has nothing to attach to. So it ends up in the aquifer. But again, back to Dr. Nancy Swanson's work. And this is a correlation of the introduction of the genetically engineered crops, corn. So this is USDA's numbers. And then she went to the CDC and got the correlation in all of these different human ailments. Okay, this one's autism. Glyphosate and autism. And this is not causation, it's correlation. Autism, in my opinion, is a multifactorial problem. Dr. Stephanie Seneff, 1 in 150 kids was the autism rate in 2007, 1 in 100 by 2009, 1 in 68 today, it's 1 in 32, and by 2032, which those kids will be born next year because they're 8 years behind in recording this, it'll be 1 or 2. This is the CDC's infant mortality rate in the United States. We're supposed to be the most developed country in the world. Slovakia is the only one worse than us for infant mortality rate. Congenital birth defects, again, correlation, not causation. Obesity. I testified at a Senate hearing in Des Moines earlier this year where they were putting forth legislation to try and give complete immunity to chemical companies from being sued for virtually any reason. They claimed it was less than that, but it was for no reason. And the Bayer lobbyist and the Bayer employee literally introduced that legislation to the committee members. And I had they had the hearing in the House first, and then they had the Senate hearing the next week. And I just took the testimony that the Bayer representatives used to make my testimony, because I basically shared with the committee what they left out. But I had science to back up everything I said, and or legal documentation from the court system and the lawsuits that had been won against Monsanto. And after they had all of the industry reps, the corn growers, the soybean association, the pork producers, the farm bureau, they had all of them testify first, and the Bayer guys introduced it, but then they got to testify again because they were in line. And then it comes around, and there was a lawyer that had testified ahead of me, and I read my prepared testimony, and they went the rest of the way around the room, and then they went to Q&A. Well, the chairman of the committee goes right back to the Bayer reps. And the Bayer lobbyist said, well, the next thing you know, they're going to try and blame obesity levels in our country on glyphosate. And I said, I'd like to address that gentleman's comment. And the chairman of the committee said, wait your turn. Didn't realize I was that far on the line. He comes back to me and, okay, you can speak. I said, well, that gentleman doesn't know how prophetic he was. I said, because the damage that glyphosate causes to the lactobacillus, enterococcus faecalis, and the bifidobacteria, research is documenting that those are absent when glyphosate residue is present, and research is also documenting that those are absent when obesity is prevalent. And the chairman says, who'd you say you are? And I had introduced myself. My name is Howard Vlieger. I'm a student of the soil. I live on a regenerative farm in northwest Iowa. I am the primary coordinator of a scientific study that was published in 2013, documenting the ill effects on pigs, on the health of pigs fed GMO grain. And I repeated that. He says, what's your title? I said, my name is Howard Vlieger. No, what's your degree? And I thought what Dr. Huber told me to say one time, and I bit my tongue and I didn't say it. Because he told me, he says, you don't have to be a rotten apple to identify one. He says, in other words, you don't have a degree. I says, I'm still working on it. I said, I'm going to HKU. He got a real blank look on his face. And then I ended up sending him scientific studies, as well as the white paper that I had written. But enough said. Diabetes. See the green line? That's the trend line to where it should be. And again, this is not causation, it's correlation. Thyroid cancer, trend line. This one jumps off the chart. That's why they're writing this legislation. That's why it's in the current Farm Bill in Washington, D.C. to give these people liability protection. They have had their butt handed to them in court because the science is against them on cancer, specifically non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. The bellwether case, which I know the attorneys on that team, the thing they had to do was prove it was a split trial. The judge granted Monsanto's motion that said you have to prove that there's science to justify it causes non-Hodgkin's lymphoma before we can do the rest of the trial. So they did that. And it was a unanimous verdict by the jury. And the judge, even though he favored Monsanto all the way through the process, said, I have never seen such a blatant irregard for the subsequent health of people in the environment as this company has exhibited. And they lost over $1 billion in that judgment, in that bellwether case. This is why they want that legislation, because they know this is coming. And when the science gets in place, the attorneys are going to have a heyday with them. That's why they want the protection. And the one that gluten intolerance, it's not gluten, it's glyphosate residue. We've got the science to document all of the symptoms. What do you see in this picture? Combine harvesting corn. I know for a fact that's Roundup Ready corn. A gentleman I know at Primgar, Iowa, noticed that his dad's Roundup Ready corn and his brother's Liberty Link corn was dustier than his non-GMO corn was. And I'll get to that example pretty quick. I advise everybody to wear an N95 mask when they're scooping corn, not when they go out in public. He sent dust samples, Roundup Ready, Liberty Link, and hog dust out of the hog confinement building, where he custom feeds hogs, to Midwest labs, and they did a CFU count. Colonization forming units. It's like measuring rain. It's the indicator. The CFU on the hog dust was 14,000 CFUs per gram. 1,000 of that was Aspergillus niger, very opportunistic fungi, and 10,000 Aspergillus and 3,000 penicillium. The Liberty Link was 7,200,000. Of that, 7 million was Aspergillus, and penicillium was 200,000. On the glyphosate resistant, it was 15,600,000, all Aspergillus species. That is the most aggressive form of fungi forming mold and mycotoxins that you can get. Protect yourself, protect your employees if they're around this dust. It could be the reason why we're seeing this type of incident during harvest season. This is an interactive slide. This is Q&A. Do you recognize the names in the center of the circle? Yes. Have you ever seen a commercial on TV or in a magazine that says, if you can't afford your medication costs, contact us, we have a program to assist you? Sponsored by AstraZeneca. Have you ever heard of atrazine? One of the oldest herbicides used in corn production, made by AstraZeneca Syngenta. That was bought out a few years ago by ChemChina, and AstraZeneca Syngenta is the #4 producer of genetically engineered crops in the world. When you see or hear bear, what's the first thing you think of? aspirin. Before they bought Monsanto, they had Aztec insecticide, Liberty herbicide, and genetically engineered crops that were Liberty Link. But now they wisely, questionable decision there, how history will reflect that purchase they made of $66 billion of a company called Monsanto. But before they owned Monsanto, did you know that Pfizer Pharmacy Upjohn was the parent company of Monsanto? So we've established the fact that all these companies in the center of the circle are in the chemical and pharmaceutical business. So we're going to start with chemical. What one word might you use to describe a chemical that kills a weed or an insect, and you're describing it to a 5-year-old child? What one word might you choose?
Poison.
One word, poison. Okay, we're using poison to raise crops. What do we raise crops for?
Food.
Cereal and grain. What do we feed the bulk of the grain to? So, in using this poison to raise the crops, if there were to be any residual effect, do you think it would be positive or negative?
Negative.
If there's an adverse effect of that poison in the grain, you feed the grain to the livestock don't feel good, who do you call for help?
That.
When a vet comes to look at your livestock, what might he recommend you give them to make them feel better? What if you want them to grow faster, what might you give them?
Steroids.
What do we raise livestock for?
Food.
Who eats the meat?
Me.
So in using this poison on the crop that could affect the grain, it might affect the livestock, do you think there's a possibility it might affect the meat? If the people eat the meat and they don't feel good, where do they go for help? After you go to the doctor, where might he send you with a piece of paper with his autograph on it? Does that present a positive cash flow for the companies in the center of the circle? I did that the first time on a tear sheet in the VFW hall here in South Dakota in 2002 to a group of farmers. And after I got done, a guy in the back raised his hand. He said, "Hey, you forgot about the Undertaker." And of course, the room breaks out in laughter. And I said, "Just remember one thing, there's not that much margin on formaldehyde." I know mothers across our country that didn't tolerate this, and it isn't used on their school grounds anymore. Dr. Huber got this picture from Gilbert Hostetler. He's a hybrid seed developer, and he had a seed sack with ears of corn in the warehouse. And he went to get them one day, and this is what he found. The mice ate the non-GMO corn, and they didn't touch the traded. So I showed that to a group of guys in Ohio. So he did his own experiment. He plants non-GMO corn, he puts a nail on the tree, and he sticks that top ear on there, and he went and borrowed a ear from the neighbors. And he literally borrowed it. He can return it pretty much unscathed, can't he? 9 months later. What do those animals know that we don't? Here are some websites that you can take a deep dive on. GMO Science, Moms Across America, Toxin Free USA. I'm blessed and privileged to know the founders of all of those organizations. Dr. Perro wrote the book, What's Making Our Children Sick, and this is her next book that will hopefully get published yet this year. I'm blessed to call her a very good friend. I call this the problem, and this is a solution. Dirt to soil. First time I met Gabe Brown, I told the truth about glyphosate, and he looked at me like, if looks could kill, I thought I'd be gone. I was interpreting his look wrong, because later, 5 years later, when he thanked me for telling him that truth and shared with me the results of what happened when they quit using it on his farm, he said, "Don't quit, Howard, keep telling." I read the first 4 chapters of this book on a plane ride home from Canada in 2011. Dr. Huber and I were up there to speak at a nutrition conference. He was the keynote. I was at a very minimal presentation, but I shared information on a foliar that we use to remediate glyphosate effects on Roundup Ready crops. I read the first 4 chapters, and I got home and I called him. He was on his way to his home in Idaho. It's about a 70-minute drive from the airport. And I said, if I interpret this book correctly, someday the comment could be made that glyphosate's going to make DDT look like mouthwash. He said, I absolutely cannot argue with that. This is another opportunity for a deep dive on the subject of GMOs. I know the authors of this book. They've updated it several times, and it puts to science to discredit the lies that are being told. I think most everybody in the room is familiar with what's going on with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Donald Trump. I was introduced to RFK a little over 8 years ago by a mutual acquaintance in California. She had 3 children that were vaccine injured, one of them severely. I got to know her through my GMO education speaking. She got to know him through the work he's done on behalf of children. And she said, can you answer some questions for him about Monsanto? And I said, well, what's he want to know? She connected us. He told me what he wanted. I answered 90% of his questions in less than a week, and I subsequently had his email address, so every time I got a new study on glyphosate, I'd shoot it his direction. And I'm blessed to be connected to an international scientific listserv that when the latest science comes out on something, I get the paper. And I would shoot it his direction. I had no idea that he was part of the head legal team that headed up the effort on the lawsuits against Monsanto, which the first one was $289 million. Lee, why can't I say his last name? The gentleman in California that was affected by it. As I said, I ended up writing that white paper for CHD because I sent that polite email correcting him on misstatements he had made. And I said, well, I can document everything I said. Well, then he thanked me on Friday, 20 minutes after he got it. On Sunday, I get a reply again from him. He copies 2 more people on. Monday, I get a reply from one of the people he copied. And he said, would you write an article about this? I said, yeah, but not today, because it was October, it was harvest time. I got it done finally in February, and I sent it to Dr. Huber, Dr. Kramer, Dr. Dunham, and Dr. Perro, so it was in essence peer-reviewed before they got it. So it's the equivalent of a white paper on glyphosate. And it's written from a layperson's point of view. I'm thankful for the education and the learning that I have, but I have no higher education. My formal education stopped at 12th grade. When your dad gets cancer and you're going to farm, you don't really have time for college. And I didn't want to go at that time anyway. Today I wished maybe I'd have paid attention to a couple classes in high school, but I have done a lot of things with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. I will assure you, I have never seen him do anything that could be remotely identified as self-serving. I have been blessed to have very direct communication. And, you know, I don't know if anyone has listened to any of the countless videos that are out here of interviews he's done. The man is absolutely sincere, to the heart on his faith. He openly talks about the addiction he had in his younger years. You know how he got over addiction? The Almighty. And he has no problem sharing it openly. I do not agree with the man on every issue. And he says publicly, if you don't agree with me on something, let's sit down and have a respectful discussion. I have done that. I have turned him on occasion. I'm still working on a few other projects. But we will stand shoulder to shoulder and fight to fight. I got in this on this path in 1989. You know how he got in it? How he got going down the trail he's on that has made his life a living hell? Plainly and simply. Because he was very successful as an environmental attorney. He was suing all of the polluters and he was winning. He was suing the government agencies and he was winning. He started river keepers and they cleaned up the mass pollution and they got fish back in those waters. And Water Keepers is now a worldwide entity. He was very successful doing that. But he's giving these talks and he's telling how mercury is polluting the bodies of water and getting into fish, and pregnant women can't eat fish because of the potential harm to the baby. Well, at that point in time, there were still mercury in many of the vaccines. When they started Children's Health Defense, it was something Mercury Project. A nurse from Minnesota came to his house in Maine, knocked on the door, introduced herself, and she had been at the talk he had given the night before. And he said, I give these talks, and he says, all of these smartly dressed women, most of them very attractive as well, were sitting in the front row. And after I'd get done talking, they would politely but strongly take me to the cleaners on why I wasn't looking at mercury in vaccines as potential harm. So this lady from Minnesota, who's a registered nurse with the whatever degree was beyond just regular nursing, bachelor's. Now she had the bachelor's, then she got her, what's the next one?
Masters.
There you go, thank you. I won't say what I was thinking about. Well, I will too. My friend in Georgia, you know what a PhD is? Dr. Ingham says pilot higher and deeper, but anyway, she comes with a box of scientific studies. After she introduced herself, I'm so-and-so, I'm the mother of a vaccine-injured child. I was awarded $250,000 for the vaccine destroying the child's life. And the $250,000 would never begin to compensate the expense she was going to have. She said, I'm not leaving here until you read these studies. And it was a stack like that. And he politely closed the door and went out on the sailboat. And when he came back, she was still there. And she said, I'm not leaving until you read these. So he said, I sat down on the front porch next door, and he said, I start flipping through them, and I'm reading the abstract. And he said, they all got the same thing. The mercury. So he had the ability to pick up the phone and call Tony Fauci and ask him about this. Well, you need to talk to Paul Offit. He's the expert on this, so he calls Paul Offit. Well, Paul Offit told him, he says, well, there's a difference in mercury. The kind that's in fish is different than what's in vaccines. And RFK had read enough science to where he said, well, can you send me the documentation of that? Of course, he never heard from him again. And he knew he was lying to him at that point in time. So at the first Children's Health Defense Conference that I was privileged to attend in Tennessee 2+ years ago, he said, I have these people to thank for wrecking a perfectly good career. But he spent the last 20 years fighting for the health of children. And now it's expanded beyond that. It's not only what is in the vaccines that's harming them. And he's not anti-vax. He's, up until how many years ago, he was fully vaccinated himself. He was getting the flu shot every year. Well, guess what? As part of his work in investigation for the legal studies, he has documented every known side effect from a vaccine. I can't ever remember the medical condition. It's dysphonia something, spasmodic his voice is messed up, okay? It's a nerve damage. It's nothing wrong with his vocal cords. He found that as a side effect to the flu vaccine. Now, he will not say that it caused his condition, but when he got that condition, he was getting a flu shot every year because that's what they did. And, you know, his life would be so much simpler and easier if he wasn't fighting on our behalf. And this, I thought I had Make America Healthy again in here. What did I do? Don't allow. Quit playing games with me, computer. Oh yeah, I do. Make America Healthy Again Now.org. I'll tell you how he got connected with Trump. Callie Means, who's become quite famous because his sister Casey Means, and he did an interview with Tucker Carlson, and now they're out there. They wrote a book. Casey was a highly accomplished tops in her class at Stanford as a doctor, went on to be tops in her field as a surgeon, and she's doing all these surgeries every day, and one day she goes, my medical training, people are sick, they're not getting better, there's no connection, what's going on? I gotta go figure this out. She walked away from her very successful medical career. Her brother Callie, you're out of your mind. He was tops in his class in business and political science. He went right out of school into a lobbying position in Washington, D.C. for none other than a pharmaceutical company. He saw how they funded the lies that were being told. He saw how the tobacco companies bought up the food companies and employed the scientists to develop addictive products in the form of processed foods that is largely contributing to the obesity in our country, along with many other things. It's multifactorial. And they wrote a book, and I can't remember the name of the book, bad on me. So Callie Means is advising Trump's campaign, and he's advising RFK's campaign. And 3 hours after the first assassination attempt, when they put a notch in that ear, and don't tell me the good Lord and the guardian angel weren't on duty that day for his turning his head and getting that part of that ear instead of going straight in. 3 hours after that happened, he called Callie and he said, see if RFK will talk to me. Callie called him. Will you talk to Trump? Yes. This is Saturday. Sunday afternoon, I'm moving around bales in the field west of the place. My phone vibrates. Hello, sir, how you doing? It was Robert F. Kennedy Jr. I need this and this and this and this and this. Can you help me? I said, yeah, how quick? And I'm thinking that right after he said what he needed, I said, he's going to talk to Trump. I said, how quick do you need it? 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. I said, gee, thanks for all the notice. I said, I'll get it. I said, what I don't know, I know who to contact, and I said, I'll get it to you in an email ASAP. I sent an email before the sun went down. Again, I'm blessed. I don't know diddly squat. I'm blessed to know a lot of people that know a lot, and I got a good memory. And I gave him exactly what he wanted. And when it came out, which I can and I can't say what I can't say, okay? So when it came out, it was no shock. But the thing that really, I was Trump's biggest supporter in 2016. In 2017, I got this book in August, and I read it. And I have given away countless copies of this book. I have a box out there with some in it. You want one? All I ask is that you read it, and when you get done reading it, you give it to somebody that gives a shit about our country. Because this is what they did. And if you don't know what they did, you can't fix it. The first time I met RFK, I gave him a copy of this. And in person, that is. I was so mad when Trump did what he did in his first term. I thought, you know, this is the real deal in 2016. I was his biggest supporter in Sioux County, and that was not a positive place to be. I got booed when I got up and spoke on his behalf at the caucus. Don't bother me. When Trump admitted RFK and gave him the okay to tell the truth that he was duped his first term in office, I thought, this is for real. I really believe this is for real. Because I've been blessed to have extensive training in personalities from one of the best in that field. And Trump's personality is known as identified by Dr. O'Connor as a dominant director. Well, the natural tendencies of a dominant director does not make a mistake. Don't happen. If they do, it's somebody else's fault. So when Trump admitted to RFK that he screwed up, I'm like, that bullet did change him. And, you know, and I didn't question RFK's decision to make the move he did, because, you know, there were so many things against him that it was becoming obvious that he couldn't win. And he said from the get-go, he said, I'm not going to be a spoiler. And now, with him and Tulsi being the co-chairs of the transition team, and typically the transition team doesn't start until the day after the election, because that's when the funding is in place for it. Well, guess what? From the day after the election until inauguration day is too small of a window. So one or I think it was multiple of Trump's donors put up the money to start that process way back then. And I'm active, and that's all I can say in that process. But when the election's over, the easy part's over. Because a friend called me from Nebraska today and he said, did you hear the interview or the debate that happened between Grassley and RFK? He said, you can't believe what asinine comment Grassley made. I said, you wouldn't surprise me any. And it's just, there's so much corruption that needs to be rooted out. But I'm an eternal optimist. I think we can win. If, you know, what's the biggest problem in our country? Apathy. An uneducated and inactive electorate. That's how we got to the mess we're in. Ben Franklin came out of the Constitutional Convention and said, what form of government do you have? And he says, a constitutional republic if you can keep it. The 7 miracles that saved the world. The last paragraph in that book says, our form of government can function by a moral, active, educated electorate. We got the dumbest and laziest electorate that's ever been in the history of our country. And, you know, when I've been in Washington, D.C., when Dr. Huber and Dr. McNeil and Bob Streit and Dave Murphy and I went there to meet with USDA in 2011, we were in the House office building to get on the elevator to go down to the cafeteria. I have never been in a more evil place in my life. The negative energy was so intense. And the people that got on that elevator, other than us, None of them had English as their native language, and I have no problem with anybody's skin color or language or ethnic background. But they were there for one reason, to see how much they could take. And it's time for the electorate to tell our elected representation, the shit stops. Period. We don't need term limits. We have them, we're just not using them. Constitutional amendments don't do us any good because they're not paying any attention to the Constitution. I worked my butt off helping Randy Feenstra defeat Steve King, because Steve King was the biggest enemy the true family farmer ever had in Washington, D.C. He was the best friend of chemical intensive industrial ag. I tried to have respectful conversations with him multiple times, face to face, on GMOs and glyphosate, and he would yell at me and turn around and walk away. I knew how he was voting. I knew what policy he was putting forward. So I believed Randy read this book. I gave it to him. Randy read Dr. Perro's book, What's Making Our Children Sick. Randy read Stephanie Seneff's book on glyphosate. I know he read them because I asked him questions about what he learned in them. So I know he read them. He knows the truth. I am so PO'd at how he deceived me and how many other people. And I look forward to the day when I'm in a place where he can't avoid me. I've seen him once. We've been in the same spot once since I come out in support of Kevin. And the first night that I met Kevin, I asked him not easy questions, and he answered every not easy question from the audience. And then I went up and I asked him more not easy questions. And he's the only person up prior to RFK that told me the truth about Afghanistan and Ukraine and the whole 9 yards. And Feenstra's sent how much money over there? And I told Feenstra, here is your introductory legislation. It's simple. I said, it's not going to pass, but I said, I want you to introduce it. All elected representatives who vote in favor of deficit spending shall be required to pledge all their personal assets as collateral towards the debt created by the legislation. Period. If the debt is not paid in full within 1 year of initiation, then all of the pledged assets shall be seized and sold at auction to the highest bidder, with all the proceeds going to pay down the debt. I just balanced the budget for eternity. I sent that to Trump in 2020, along with this book and a letter, registered mail, and a check for $2,400, returning the money that he put in, the IRS put in my and my wife's account from that unconstitutional legislation. I bit my tongue there, in case you didn't notice. And guess when my check was deposited in the bank? January 21 of 21. Inauguration day is when they put my check in the bank. When I sent his wife a copy of Dr. Perro's book, I got a really nice thank you card in less than 2 weeks. And my conservative friend in South Dakota that was an ardent Trump supporter, well, he don't open his own mail. I says, I believe that. But is he in charge of seeing who does? He owns everything that he's done wrong. Nobody gets a free pass. Every one of us gets forgiveness if we ask for it with a sincere heart. But I believe we have a future, even though it's, we got a big hole to dig out of, but I believe we have a future with those two joining forces. And it's going to take all of us to kick the hiney of Grassley and Ernst and Feenstra.
And get Kevin elected.
Yes.
Seriously.
It's I had his sign on the end of the driveway. And in case you're wondering about where that sign come from that he's got, I bought it. The print shop in Lamar's made them. Kevin knows them well.
Oh, yeah. Number one customer.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, Pam's one of our customers. We direct market beef, pork, chicken, turkey, lamb, eggs, and milk from our farm.
Wow.
So what's your replacement for glyphosate?
You got it?
I might have it. How many farmers do you know that are using ducks for weed control?
Using what?
Ducks.
Let it,
Ducks,
Ducks.
you know, quack, quack, ducks.
you wanna go back 40 or 50 years, maybe you can turn that around on the glyphosate and get back to more medium-sized farms. But of these guys, 20,000 acres. I don't know how how they're gonna replace glyphosate with just another, it's just gonna be another chemical that they haven't tested.
Okay. Gabe Brown co-founded a company called Understanding Ag. And Gabe went down the path he went on his farm for the same reason I did. Mine was desperation, his was desperation. He got hailed out 3 years in a row in the early 80s. And he learned what he learned, in essence, the hard way of what regenerative ag will do. The thing that they have done now, they have started a company that provides the information of how to successfully transition into this type of crop production. Rick Clark is a regenerative farmer, certified organic, and he has 17,000 acres. Don't tell me it can't be done big scale. But you're right from your perception and your comment. The thing that we have to do if you read this book, when Vance Smith gave that presentation in Sioux Center, Iowa in August of 2017, I was sitting in the front row taking notes, and boy, he was filling in gaps that I had, and this book filled in the rest of them, or a lot of them. I raised my hand when it was Q&A time, and I said, would you agree that the same people you described in your presentation hijacked or kidnapped our land-grant university system and our medical school system simultaneously many years ago? And he's without hesitation said, absolutely. Well, guess what? They hijacked the entire education system in our country. The book will explain that. And they did it on purpose. We need to implement the education process to make this successful. And is it going to be 100%? Absolutely not. It's not going to. But I live in the river bottom on the west branch of the Floyd. The Floyd, I'm south of Morris, and the Floyd River starts up by Hartley. There's 80,000 acres in my watershed. My folks moved on that place in 1959. They talked about the flood of 53 where the water hit the bottom of the railroad bridge. The water went over the railroad tracks on the 22nd of June of 2024, and it washed out about 500 feet of track. The water went over the dike on the north side of our farm, and when they put that dike in 1972, when they raised the road 13 feet in front of our farm, they said the water would never go over the dike. Well, never was June 22 at 11:15 a.m. The devastation that caused was immense. We're still rebuilding what was damaged. I had the NRCS come out and do water infiltration tests on our farm and across the fence. And across the fence, they're one of the biggest farmers in the county. And if it calls for a quart, they'll put on a quart and a half. And if one trip with the tillage is good, they'll do two. and we did water infiltration tests. You drive a 6-inch pipe in the ground, you do it in the row and between the row, and you put a piece of cellophane on top, and you put the measured amount of water, which equals 1 inch of rain. You pull the cellophane away and you time it. The first inch in the row on my field went in the ground in 21 seconds. Long story short, they did that at my farm and across the fence, and another regenerative farm and across the fence. Across the fence at my place, you know how much water that land could take? Per hour? 0.48. We took 17 inches in an hour. And I was disappointed with that. I thought it'd be over 20. But that cornfield was following cereal rye, and it was a little wet when we took the bales off. We baled it for baleage, and then it wasn't ideal putting the corn in, so I probably messed a few things up. Rick Clark in Indiana's getting 30 inches per hour.
Yeah, we used to think about compaction, now they never even think about it. You know, that in
Let me finish.
25 or 30 years ago, that was a big concern.
Let me finish. 80,000 acres in my watershed. I did the rate per acre, I did the rate per section, I did the rate per 80,000 acres. There was 1.7 trillion gallons in change run away in that watershed that didn't have to if it would have taken the average of the 16.5 inches. They had 16 inches at the other regenerative farm, 17 at ours. So that's 16.5 inches. That would have saved Rock Valley, that would have saved Haywarden, that would have saved Spencer, that would have saved Spirit Lake, that would have saved Cherokee. It's not necessary. And will you have 300 bushel corn? Maybe. I've seen 300 bushel organic corn. It can be done. It requires a lot more management. But the bigger question is, what's the quality of what's being raised? I will bet anybody the cost of the analysis at the laboratory that every single genetically engineered crop that's being harvested has glyphosate residue in it. And it took 1/10 of a part per billion to cause non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So are we going to, you know, the consensus of the committee in Des Moines at the Senate hearing was, well, we can't afford the economic harm this would cause. And I said I'd like to make a comment. I says, if you want to generate economic activity, you keep going the direction you're going, because you're going to increase the healthcare costs so substantially you're never going to see the top of it. Because how it's being raised is making the people sick and killing them. And they don't want them to die before they get a chance to treat them. Because that's profitable.
You might farm 17,000 acres organic, but there's a couple farmers in this audience. And we go back to full tillage.
You don't have to go back full till. Regenerative is no till, zero till.
And how are you going to control the weeds? I played.
That's
with,
why they have an education
I
process.
played with no-till once in the 80s, and
No till without
that
the
was before
regenerative.
Roundup. That's when we used the good chemicals that everybody hates now, like atrazine and Blade X and liquid nitrogen.
Right, but no till without the full implementation of the regenerative concepts does not bring the ability of the soil back where it can and should be. We're farming in line with the good Lord's design when we implement this. And is it going to be weed free? No. But if you got a weed in the field, that doesn't make you a heretic and disable you from going to church on Sunday morning. Although that may be the thought process, and it's been hammered into our head, the only way we're going to make money is to grow more. Well, who's growing more good for? The pharmaceutical / chemical / fertilizer company that's also selling the medicine to make the animals and the people. They're not making them better, they're treating them.